Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to another amazing Saturday session, a Q&A for Surah al-Hajj and Surah al-Fath. Inshallah, it's going to be a great opportunity to re-engage with these two incredible surahs. Of course, I first want to just call out again the incredible khutbah from yesterday, which is called On Diversity and Inheriting Gold. Will the Quran testify for or against us? And in it, one of the things that was so powerful is Sheikh talks about the majesty of diversity and skin color and difference among us as part of God's plan, part of God's creation, and emphasizes, especially in a world where there's so much racism, so much classism and division, that when we as Muslims or as humanity don't honor this diversity and creation as a way to get to know the divine, we are really dishonoring God. And you know, he makes a really important point that this is something that is unique to the Islamic message, and that interestingly had, you know, either the Jews or the Christians had something like this in the Old Testament or the New Testament that really pointed out, you know, the majesty of diversity as part of God's plan, that ultimately probably would have been held against us today in this Islamophobic age. But this is like one of these pieces of gold that is dropped, you know, from the Quran to us as human beings, you know, as Muslims, and we could take this bit of gold and run with it, as you know, as with so much gold that's in the Quran, especially as we're finding here today, and or, you know, in the halakas here, and how much opportunity that we have as bearers of this message to really advance Muslims and humanity forward. But that ultimately, you know, when the Quran as a gift is given to us as Muslims and we don't honor it and we don't, you know, use these you know, bits of gold and move them forward, then rather than being a gift to us, the Quran can actually become, you know, a testimony against us and what we didn't do in upholding our responsibility. And it was just an incredible khutbah as always, and you know, really underscores again just the racism in our world, especially unfortunately against Muslims. And you know, this was sort of interesting because, I mean, I always say there's no coincidences. So I was sort of cruising around on Facebook last night and found a group where a woman had posted this message, and I thought I would share this with you because it was sort of pertinent. So she says to the group, Salam, I am providing Rishta matchmaking for our community for free. Please message me your son or daughter's profile. And I'm only going to introduce families, and, you know, I'm not collecting pictures. You can exchange, you know, with families on your own. But here are the details that I need. And so here's the detail list. Number 1, gender. Number 2, hijabi or non-hijabi. Number 3, marital status, single, never married, divorced, or other. Then age, height, ethnicity, religious sect, language, citizen status, city living in, right? Education, job, traits and description, interests, and then contact number. So this was really striking to me. I thought, okay, so number 1, obviously gender. 2, or you know, really at the top of the list, hijabi or non-hijabi, you know, and then on down the line. And I thought to myself, okay, where is the section on, you know, piety? Does this person pray? Does this person have a religious education or anything that has to do with what would presumably identify you as a Muslim or what should be important to you? And it reminded me of something that I had written many years ago, many moons ago. I had written a column for Muslim Girl magazine where I was able to share a lot of what I had learned from the Sheikh. And this was actually, I wanted to share this because actually this came up also in another conversation I had during the week about marriage criteria. And this was something that that Sheikh actually shared with me very early on when we met, I think even before we were married. And so let me just take a little excerpt of this because I'd never heard this anywhere before. He says, the vast majority of jurists agree that the most important criteria for marriage or choosing a marital partner in order of priority are 1, the person's level of piety, 2, the person's level of Islamic knowledge, 3, the degree to which a person has good manners, 4, the person's family upbringing and the quality of their family, And five, lastly, then five, the person's looks, personality, and personal habits. And in addition, there are other lessons in our tradition about how to achieve a successful marriage. And Sheikh talks about this in actually a very wonderful series on marriage and divorce, which is available. It's a halakha that went on, I think, for 8 sessions or so. It's available on our SoundCloud channel, the Suli SoundCloud channel. And these are, traditions of the Prophet that give a lot of insight into, what makes a successful marriage. And so, really, when you compare, it's really striking. And, you can't help but think like this is really, one place, one start where a lot of change can happen, to improve our world and our situation, hopefully, as Muslims. And so, the talk or the khutbah yesterday was just so apropos about, racism and how that's, something that's so counter to our tradition. And this was something from 1,400 years ago, before even race and critical race studies and all of these other issues even became, on our radar at all. So I just thought I would share that for whatever that's worth. It was really powerful for me, and knowing those criteria, alhamdulillah, I feel like, well, alhamdulillah, look what I ended up with. But alhamdulillah, it's like these are things that you wish you knew and that you want to share with, with your kids and your friends, things that are part of our tradition that are so valuable for, setting the course of your life. Anyway, with that, I am so excited to jump into the Q&A for these 2 surahs. And of course, unless you have something that you'd like to start with, my favorite jumping off point is just to ask you about your engagement with, Surah Hajj and Surah Fath, and where you were and what was, occupying your mind, your life, your inquiry, and your research. So thank you for joining us, everybody.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد الحبيب المصطفى خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. There, I'm trying to. Okay, so first Surah al-Hajj. I remember that for some reason, it just stuck with me that I focused on Surah al-Hajj after Surah al-Nur. I mean, what, yeah, and I'm having a hard time remembering exactly where I was or what I was doing. But I was always under the impression that Surah al-Hajj, and this is just from an Islamic education, that Surah al-Hajj was affirming or mandating the obligation of Hajj upon Muslims. But I had not, and I had not noticed that any real emphasis on the fact that indeed it was not revealed after Surah An-Nur, um, as as I've read in many sources, that in fact Surah Al-Hajj was revealed at the time of the Hijrah. And once you learn that, once you realize that Surah Al-Hajj was actually revealed at this critical point at the time of Hijrah, it, if you're looking at this as a legal legislation, it made little sense for Hajj to be decreed at the time. If we are talking about the Quranic philosophy in legislating, then I would have expected Hajj to be legislated later. I mean, it would have made sense, for instance, if it was legislated at the time of the Surah al-Fath is revealed. But that wasn't the case. And the fact that it's revealed at the time of Hijrah, then that sort of opened the door to other things. The fact that Surah Al-Hajj is really, yes, it mentions Al-Hajj, but the point is not to legislate Al-Hajj. That is not the point. In fact, it's sort of it assumes that the followers of the Prophet ﷺ already understood what Hajj, the importance of Hajj is. But this, the way it talks about the cycles of human life, or the cycle of human life, and the way that it talks about time and space, and the way that at this critical point in Hijrah, as Muslims are leaving Mecca and they don't know whether they're going to ever see Mecca again, and many of them didn't. You know, those who died didn't see Mecca again. And they don't, I mean, there's no reason for them to believe that they will, at this point, I mean, I think it would have been quite a wild idea that they're going to someday conquer Quraysh and control Mecca. You know, Surah Al-Hajj, the first time you have the permission to fight, just a license to defend yourself through the use of arms, is in Surah Al-Hajj. So then you ask these questions of, you know, you're standing at the doorstep of what you sense is a message that is a more existential message. It's not just about Hajj, but it is about our very existence and the very reason to be for us as Muslims. And so then you try to get a sense, or to the extent possible, of the impact, the way that the early, especially the companions, had interacted with Surah Al-Hajj. You know, what type of impact it had upon them. And this then, I mean, among the many, there's many different things that you notice, but among them is that Surah Al-Hajj becomes, for instance, quite influential in the Sufi tradition. So it's clear that generations of Muslims un, understood it existentially, and and you get among much later Muslims, especially with figures like Jilani or Ibn Arabi, some references about the nature of time and space that are extremely intriguing, inspired by Surah Al-Hajj. Um, so, I mean, it's sort of embarrassing to say, but Surah Al-Hajj went from a surah that um, I had no idea how critical of a surah it is until after the full journey. Then you realize that in fact it is a foundational surah for the entire Medina period, and that when you read, for instance, that such and such companion or such and such companion would read Surah Al-Hajj every night, or would read it in Shafa, or would when they prayed Shafa, or when they prayed um, um, Salat al-Qunut, or then you start understanding what Surah Al-Hajj was about. That the way people interacted with it, and especially the companions that were quite close to the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, those who have been around from the time of Hijrah, not the latecomers to Islam. Um, yeah. Now, Surah Al-Fath is has always been. You know that Surah Al-Fath is historically tied to the events in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So that's a surah that historically dates itself. It's talking about a very particular set of historical events. But what you there are several fascinating things that you notice about the surah once you delve into it. Is that um, the amount of predictions as to what will transpire in the future. And I've dealt with Surah Al-Fatih, it was among the last surah that I've dealt with in the Quran. I actually thought initially, um, you read that Surah Al-Fatih was revealed after Surah Al-Nisa, which is impossible. I mean, Surah Al-Nisa is the fourth Hijri year, and Surah Al-Fath is the sixth Hijri year. So the chronology, as reported, is wrong. But then Surah Al-Fath, the amount of historical predictions, the tone of the surah in talking to Muslims about their future is very different than earlier surah. Here, it is specifically, literally informing the people who engaged in the Bay'at al-Ridwan, in the pledge of Ridwan, the pledge under the tree, and who, in fact, and it's very striking that those who were so committed that they embarked not on a battle, but on a mission of peace. And it comes to those people, the ones who were willing to commit themselves to a mission in which they could be slaughtered without much of a fight. And it chooses this opportunity to then tell them something about what will happen in the future. It gives you the striking thing, it gave me a very strong sense of, before you have grounds to object or whine or complain, or protest or say it's not fair, or the extent to which you have to prove yourself, the extent to which, and subhanAllah, of course, I didn't, this came only in the presentation here, that Surah al-Hajj talks about those who worship God on an edge. That, if things are going their way, they're happy. Things are not going their way, they fall apart and they despair. And then the embodiment of what that means we see in Surah al-Fath, because those who gave the pledge under the tree were not those who worshiped God at an edge. And in fact, you can completely imagine those who do worship God at an edge, just borderline conviction, wavering type of conviction, are in fact told by God that you are not allowed to join us when we go to war again. Now, in every, when especially the Quran of Medina, is often talking about events, historical events that unfolded at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But interpretively, the question that a faithful interpreter would have to ask themselves is that, why would God choose to address a particular historical event? If you will, what is the anecdotal lesson that God is communicating to us? We cannot wait around to reproduce what the Prophet ﷺ had for the Quran to be relevant. And this is part of the Muslim alienation from the Quran. That if you basically want to wait around to have a faithful group of people like Ahlul Bayt and like the companions of the Prophet, who gather around a central figure who is prophet-like, and then the Quran of Medina would become relevant to you, that's a failed project. The Quran of Mecca is the foundation for the Quran of Medina, and the Quran of Medina must have a constant relevance to human beings on a steady and constant, in a steady and constant dynamic. And so both of these surah, because they are so embedded in a historical circumstance, especially, of course, al-Fath, the question that I pursued in research is, what is the takeaway for the average human being who might never have the opportunity of encountering a set of historical circumstance, even anywhere similar to what the Prophet ﷺ encountered. What is the ethical, moral lesson that we end up with? Surah al-Fath was towards, I mean, it was about a year before the end of my journey with the Quran. I mean, my journey never ends with the Quran, but I mean, what became the project Illumine. I would think Surah al-Hajj was probably a year before that, or maybe even more than a year before that. Which is a year after we moved to Thousand Oaks. So what year is that?
2015. So Hajj was, so we,
No. So no, then it was more than that because I think I remember Hajj. I was still working on Hajj in 2016. So
we were in Thousand Oaks.
Yeah, after moving to Thousand Oaks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll maybe remember other things as we go on, but but you know, I have to say again, because you raised this before, and this is something that I've struggled with a lot. In Surah al-Fath, you have these tribes that, and this is the most unnerving thing, is that you have these tribes who do a very human thing. They sort of look at the matter rationally. They calculate the cost and benefit, and they say, you're going to go because you had a vision. You're going to go present yourself, literally hand your neck out to Mecca. You're going to go without weapons, dressed in ihram, so you're not fighting clothes, no war gear, and all Mecca, and this is the same Mecca that had tried to assassinate you, and this is the same Mecca that formed an alliance, and we laid siege to Medina. And when they went to the Prophet ﷺ, they didn't say to him, you're wrong, we don't want to follow you. They did a very human thing. They were dishonest. They made excuses. We're busy. Our children, our jobs, our business, and again, very struck by the fact that the style of the Prophet ﷺ, he knew they were lying. He knew that these were excuses. He simply kept quiet. He didn't say, yes, no problem, stay home. He just simply did not comment, didn't respond. And they took that as an excuse to defer to their whims. And I've asked myself, like I think every Muslim should ask themselves this: what would have been my position if I was there at the time? The type of faith and conviction, and we saw that again with Laylat al-Qadr, when the Prophet ﷺ, Surah wal-Maraj, when the Prophet, not Laylat al-Qadr, Surah wal-Maraj, when the Prophet ﷺ says that, I've journeyed to Jerusalem, the type of iman that would say, I surrender, I am fully in, and even if ultimately the cost is I give up everything on this earth. And then, of course, to ask the logical question, why would God share with us that standard of Iman? And as I said, if you're waiting around and you, as a lot of Muslims, if they're honest with themselves, they'll say, oh yeah, we would be very committed if there was a real Muslim ummah and there was a real cause and real conviction and that cop out, which renders the Quran irrelevant. How can you show this type of conviction in the circumstances of your life? Because that has even affected my career. I mean, when everyone that knows how the academia is, unfortunately, academics are the majority of academics for the majority of time are cowards. They use the sophistication of academic language and sophistication of academic constructs to keep themselves out of trouble by negotiating marginality. Anytime you are pressed on saying, are you saying X? You say, well, I'm not really, well, I'm saying XYZ and 10 other letters. And I know just from many life experience that the attitude that you confront with a lot of Muslims is, oh well, yeah, it made sense for that type of bay'at al-ridwan, that pledge given under the tree. It made sense because the Prophet was around, because there was this Muslim state, because and it reaches the point. I mean, that same type of frame of mind, that same type of attitude, is embodied, is epitomized in the approach of someone like Mahmoud Taha and his student Abdullah Naim, who tell you, oh, the Quran of Medina is abrogated. Why? Because what they're saying is, oh, the Quran of Medina addressed a specific historical circumstance. Well, we don't have this historical circumstance, so it's irrelevant. But but what they've articulated, what a lot of Muslims feel and do anyway. They just articulated it. So the truth of the matter is that we do treat much of the Quran of Medina as irrelevant. But this is the thing. When you treat the Quran of Medina as irrelevant, there is no way of upholding the Quran of Mecca. Because if you have ethical abstractions, but no case studies of these ethical abstractions, the entire enterprise just crashes down. Ethical abstractions without any concrete examples lead you nowhere. This methodology of what is the ethical example that is being illustrated here? What is the takeaway? And so if this is the sacrifice they were making, how does that translate into the sacrifice I should be making in my life under my circumstance. Um, yeah, I mean, that has been like a guiding principle throughout this journey. And especially with these surah like al-Ahzab, you have a siege, and people will say, we need to go protect our family. I can completely see myself doing that in a moment of weakness. Uh, you know, you're on hijrah and you're being given permission to fight, and you're sad because you're leaving your homeland. The Quraysh has taken your home, your property. You've sacrificed everything. You don't have a job. You're poor. You're going to go start a new life. And the Quran is talking to you about primordial time and primordial ethics. And I again, at a moment of weakness, you can see yourself, if you're being honest with yourself, see yourself saying, what is this? I don't have time to listen to this. I need to figure out how am I going to take care of myself? Where am I going to live? How am I going to take care of, isn't it enough that I've just abandoned everything and just going on this journey for Allah? I mean, I have to sit there and think about how God created the space for Ibrahim. And what is this? You call for prayer, and people will come from all over the world to worship God. Well, we've just been kicked out of this place, and you're telling me people are going to come all over the world to worship God? I mean, again, why would God give us these examples? And then you come to al-Fath, and we've just finished a peace treaty that sounds like a treaty of submission, an unequal treaty. And after going on what felt like a suicide mission, and the Quran comes and says, you know, you're going to enter a new stage where the real challenge is that you're going to fight people who are more powerful than any of the people you fought before. Um, Allah wouldn't put these types of discourses if these type of discourses were not intended to be elevating, to help you grow up. You can ignore them, but then the Quran becomes then exactly like the khutbah was talking about. Then God has given you the book, and you've done nothing with it. Or you could take these messages to heart, and then you must grow.
Alhamdulillah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. There's always, it's just so sobering, and it's, it reminds me, like, you sit here and you've dedicated your last 2 years, really focused on the Quran. And so when you were saying, like, people say, yeah, if I lived in the time of the Prophet, I would have, been there. It would have been different because the Prophet was there and these circumstances happened and all of that. And it just reminds me, like, we're here studying the Quran, and it's like such a small audience that even cares about what we're doing. And so it's very natural to just think, yeah, what would I have done? And actually, this whole experience with the halakas has made me very grateful that I was not alive at the time of the Prophet. Like, there's no way. It was so difficult. But alhamdulillah, this is such an incredible gift. Let me open it up to people here first, with anyone, if anyone has any questions. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Do you want to start? Thank you.
Thank you, Sheikh. My questions are about Surah al-Hajj. Would it be correct to understand, given the timing of, I was also perplexed by the timing of the revelation, given that it was during the Hijrah, and it's a time when you're leaving Mecca. You're kind of putting Mecca in on the back burner in your mind, and thinking about, okay, how do we establish a new life and a new home and build here, for an indefinite period of time? And is it correct to understand the surah in a way of like, ultimately your objective is still Mecca? You're going to get distracted with all kinds of things that you have to do in Medina, which is clearly still important, but the ultimate objective is Mecca, and this has to be. It is the responsibility of these Muslims at this time to. God is directly telling you, you have to take Mecca back. This can't. Is that correct? And then a follow up. Is there a relationship between Makkannakum or a tamkeen fil ard and Mecca itself?
I mean, okay. What's fascinating, I mean, this is again, in that Surah al-Hajj, it could be understood as that is what is implied, but it doesn't say explicitly that you must take Mecca back. In fact, what it says, it talks about those who إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأمروا بالمعروف ونهوا عن المنكر. That those who, if empowered, will أقاموا الصلاة, then they will establish prayer and zakah, charity, and the obligation of al-amr bil ma'ruf and nahy an al-munkar, which is the core obligation for all normative ethical duties. And then Surah al-Hajj ends with the call to al-jihad fillah. So it could have the express language could have said that you have an obligation to perform jihad to capture Mecca, but it doesn't, and it doesn't say it explicitly. If you maybe well, actually, let me strike that. It's not maybe. I think that the danger in saying this is about recapturing Mecca is that then it would have become a sort of a nationalistic cause. You've been kicked out of Mecca, so now you have an obligation to fight over territory. And then it could have easily gone very wrong. Then it all becomes about boundaries and territories. And I think it's quite intentional that Allah communicates to Muslims why Mecca, because this is the spot revealed to the Prophet Ibrahim, and this is the spot chosen by Allah for Tawheed. But Surah Al-Hajj, I think, quite intentionally doesn't make it about territories, but makes it about tamkeen fil ard and what you do after tamkeen fil ard, and makes it about a jihad fillah. So it's like saying, before we even talk about land or territory, you have an obligation your jihad has to be a jihad to come closer to Allah, because this is ultimately what this is the starting point. There is no way forward for anything else. And was the amazing subtlety of the Quran is that it said, وَجَاهَدُوا فِي اللَّهِ حَقَّ جِهَادِهِ. So وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ, that at the same time, this is not about doing what, following a law of ritual and practice. This is not what jihad means. It's not about following a difficult or a strenuous law of rituals. That's not a jihad fillah. But then, right in that same ayah, toward the closing of Surah al-Hajj, we are reminded again that this is millat Ibrahim, millat abikum Ibrahim, huwa sammakum al-Muslimin. That it is as if the jihad is not just to grow in Allah, but to also understand your relationship to the message of Tawheed from the beginning of time till, so that the challenge is not fulfilled, Muslims, by simply by doing what nationalists do, by celebrating the Prophet Muhammad, and that's it, and saying it's all about Muhammad. The challenge is not met by saying let's make Medina better than any other place in the world. The challenge is not met by saying let's do everything to reconquer our abandoned homes. The remarkable thing is that the Quran persistently speaks the language of morality and ethics for those who understand the Quran. It never becomes about land. It never becomes about boundaries. It never becomes about identity. It's always the language of substantive morality. And of course, not to forget, we cannot forget that Surah al-Hajj closes with the theme of witnessing. That then it comes and it tells these migrants who are embarking upon this hijrah that you, in the same way that the Prophet ﷺ is going to bear witness as to your morality, you have an obligation to bear witness for God as to the morality of yourselves and those that you encounter. This is the world of hadith preserves narrations in which the Prophet ﷺ is deeply touched by God telling him that you have an obligation to bear witness for God as to Muslims, but it didn't preserve for us the impact on Muslims when they're told that. Because if we read that this was striking to the Prophet, well, that's only half the equation. It's half what the Prophet ﷺ has to bear witness to is only half of the equation. The other equation is that what Muslims have to bear witness to. And you get into, when you read, especially in adab, when you read literature, um, you try to understand why early Muslims, or what was often cited by early Muslims as to the sponge factor, the fact that they became like a civilizational sponge, taking in the sciences and the knowledge systems and of from going from, for centuries, a fairly closed society, a society that honored habits and customs and traditions, so much so that they've been doing the way they've been doing things in the heart of Arabia for centuries, resisting all influences, resisting Yemeni influences, resisting Abyssinian influences, resisting Persian, resisting Byzantine influences. And then suddenly they transform from that fairly closed mindset to a radically different mindset, where now they are absorbing, just taking in the civilizations of those. And you find these tantalizing references, especially in adab or in poetry and so on, where um, a, quick reference to the endowment of Dar al Hikmah is, or in early debate, do we call it Dar al Hikmah or Dar al Shahada? For me, that's extremely significant. It's like like an archaeologist who's investigating, and when you see something like that, oh wow, okay, so that concept of Shahada must have informed, because if the fact that they even have that discussion, it must have meant that that's the and of course part of the journey of the Islamic civilization is going from the opening of the Muslim mind to the closing of the Muslim mind again, because of dictatorship and and despotism and the nature of empires. It's like they when diversity becomes a threat to centralized power, and centralized power tries to clamp down again by after opening its doors. So yeah. Anyway.
Question? Okay. There.
By the way, did I mention the dhikr for the surah or no?
Actually, I'm not sure, but let's do it again.
Oh, the dhikr?
Yes, can you tell us the dhikr
Yeah,
for both?
the dhikr for Surat al-Hajj is 76 and 77.
Okay, and how about for Fath?
Oh, sorry, it's no, I'm off one number. 77 and 78.
Okay.
And al-Fath it's 29. Let me make sure. Yeah, it is 29.
Okay. You ready?
Yes. Maybe there's not much more to add on this, but just because in the halaqah on Surah al-Fath, you had mentioned that you were going to talk more about the prophets witnessing, because it mentions,
Oh.
you'll be witnesses and the prophet will be witness. You just said that you were going to elaborate more on that later on in the beginning of the halaqah, so I was just wondering if there is more that you can that was verse 8.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. شاهدا ومبشرا ونذيرا. Um, what I of course, this is not the only place that you have that expression that the Prophet is Shahid and Mubashir wa Nadir. So Nadir, we know warner, and Mubashir is bringing of good tidings or good news. And as I said, that the like uh, evangelism in Christianity is called tabshir. The idea, the same notion as that, the message of good news. Um, the shahid, what I wanted to flag when I mentioned the Surah al-Fath, is that the the um, the role of witnessing in the Quran is far more distinct than either in the Torah or the Injil. The, the and when you notice that, especially when it occurs as it does in Surah Al-Fath, as core to the role of prophecy, um, the Shahada is necessarily a moral function. That you are your very existence. It's like the very idea of a shaheed, of an idea of even a martyr. Why is a martyr referred to as a shaheed? Is because someone who witnesses as to what ought to be by sacrificing their lives. Now, when we describe the function of the Prophet ﷺ as a shahid, and we notice that Muslims were not given the description of being mundhirin or mubashirin by the Quran, but it was given, they were given the role of shuhada. So shuhada an-nas. So, which is, I mean, an interesting point, because it's like you Muslims, if you are going to understand your own function, it is to bear witness for God as to the norms that you embody and other human beings embody. So it's a moral function rather than what often religious people think themselves of. If they are warners or bringing of good, they bring good news. It's more like they're part of a competition, like they're part of teams competing. I'm bringing either a warning to you or I'm bringing good. No, the function emphasized for Muslims in the Quran is that your function is, to put it bluntly, is to bear witness for morality, bear witness for what is right, which is much closer, by the way, to the function of a mudhakkir, of someone who reminds, rather than someone who warns or someone who brings good news. That's the point that which is, I mean, interesting, because in Islamic, then you do find that in the in this what followed after Surah Al-Fath, as we know, is that the Treaty of Hudaybiyah then, as we talked about, allowed the spread of Islam. Islam spread during the few years of peace more than it had ever spread before. And because Muslims have not written their own history, they have not noticed that it was an Orientalist that came and wrote that famous book, The Preaching of Islam. Muslims themselves have not written the history of the preaching of Islam. We've written histories about the spread of Islam, al-Futuhat al-Islamiyya. But if we would have written histories about the preaching of Islam, it is striking that Muslims, unlike Christians, refrain from describing their activity as either inzar or as mubashirin, which is something distinctly Christian. It's as if, my sense is, it's as if both functions are too haughty, too arrogant. The missionaries of Islam, and again, it's very interesting that the missionaries were often merchants and traders who believed that they spread Islam by example rather than by actual preaching. All of these, I mean, if the day comes that Muslims actually become the authors of their own history, maybe there will be a great deal to learn.
Sorry, can you just repeat again you used Arabic terms and I got so a mudhakkar is more like someone who reminds.
Oh,
versus...
mudhakkar is someone, the Quran uses the word tazkir or mudhakkar as someone who reminds, a reminder, and describes the Prophet as a reminder and not a reminder to people, not a controller of people.
And there was a second word that you used.
What was the second word?
I'm not sure, but then when you went on and said that this is not about bringing good news and that these terms were haughty, what were the terms that you
Mubashir is someone who is like an evangelist, someone who brings good news, and Mundhir is someone who is a warner.
Okay.
God is a warner, and the Prophet ﷺ is a warner. But
Okay, thank you. Sharif, did you have a question? Anybody else have a question? Marwa? Okay, Joe? All right, I wanted to actually ask a question or a couple of questions, if that's okay. At the end of Surah Fath, you told us about, obviously, the idea of Muslims being one body. And, obviously the surah went through the discussion of the different situations in which people, questioned and they weren't loyal and then they made excuses and whatever. And then ultimately there was the core group of people that stayed with the Prophet and were loyal and really believed in just trusting Allah and surrendering everything and just, right? So when we talk about one body, who should we consider one body, in our time? Because clearly we learned so much in my mind with Surah Hajj and Surah Fath together, this idea of let Allah settle the differences between us. You just focus on justice, you focus on empowerment. So there's a message of stop fighting, right? You just focus on doing your part. And so with that, then would it be correct to say when we talk about, we're one ummah, one body, just assume the best of everyone who claims to be Muslim and,
it doesn't mean that if we're one body, that all Muslims represent you, or that you represent all Muslims. The first, I mean, I mentioned the one body point, especially as to when what elicited the pledge under the tree Bayat al-Radwan is that Osman went to negotiate, and they thought Osman was killed. And the idea that someone that they sent to represent them as Muslims would be betrayed and killed, something that meant that they had no choice. They all had to commit to having consequences follow from that. Now, but you know, I mean, you notice that um, it what 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 elicited Bayat al-Radwan, what elicited that pledge that okay, we all promise that now we are going to fight to the last man, and regardless of the consequences, is because Osman was on a function representing Muslims. I mean, he was going to negotiate on behalf of the Prophet ﷺ and his followers who were on this mission. But so I mean, here I can completely see modern Muslims. They well, ironically, I mean, you see this sense of solidarity and loyalty among non-Muslims. So among Israelis, for instance, or among um, white Europeans or white Americans, you see it much stronger than with Muslims today. I could completely see Muslims. If one of them is betrayed, even if that person was representing them and or looking out for their interests or speaking on their behalf or defending their rights, I can completely see modern Muslims making every excuse to basically ignore the the fact that one of their own is betrayed and so on. But I think what the point you're getting at, though, is this whole notion of one ummah. We are anyone that says the shahada, even if I have all the disagreements, uh, you know, all the theological disagreements with them, their rights represent my rights because what I owe them, as the Prophet ﷺ, is justice. And what I mean by that if what I owe them, if they commit injustice, then I owe them the obligation of opposing their injustice, standing against their injustice, trying to get them to refrain from committing injustice. Um, and if they act justly, then as a fellow Muslim, I owe them aid and support. So and this is, when I speak about the injustice committed by fellow Muslims, the injustice committed in countries like Egypt or Syria or Saudi, or it actually comes out of that sense of solidarity that we're all one. As the Prophet ﷺ said, you must aid your Muslim brother and sister right or wrong. And when it's asked, well, how can we aid them? Okay, we understand if they're right, but what do you mean aid them if they're wrong? Is said by preventing them from committing what is wrong. The way I express this aid, that if if a Muslim acts immorally, I must speak against this immorality. Even that obligation is even far more the case than if a non-Muslim acts immorally. Now, of course, if they suffer injustice, then it goes without saying, then I must speak against the injustice that they suffer, regardless of whether I agree with them or I don't agree with them. This is um, the very base. I mean, the people, because they're, again, this is a lack of education of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is think that to be one is to overlook the that you cover up for your fellow Muslim if they're acting immorally. No, it's you actually have an obligation to prevent them from being immoral, to stand up against it.
Thank you. I just also wanted to ask, so if I understand, like your question when you're approaching these surahs about, like what is the takeaway for every human being who might never encounter this type of historical circumstance? What is the lesson of these surahs? So to me, it was very powerful, the idea that between both Fath and Hajj, obviously the idea of trust and surrender, that I don't know what's right, only Allah knows, you don't. So, like Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a vision, and, we're going forward because we think this is going to happen, and it actually doesn't happen, and then other things happen, and then ultimately we find that it's a path to victory that we didn't anticipate. So, the lesson very clearly is trust in Allah, surrender. From the message from Hajj, you fight for justice regardless of your differences. The idea of tamkeen fil ard is empowerment. If you have empowerment, here's what you need to do with it. And then something very beautiful that you said at the end of Surah Fath is that true faith spreads like seeds in search of fertile ground.
Right.
So when I put all of that together and I think about, okay, what does that mean for our time and what is on us? So I, especially for Muslims in America, we have empowerment. We don't, we have freedom more than any Muslim in any Muslim country. We can speak our mind. We don't have to be afraid that someone's going to knock on our door at Fajr and, take us, imprison us. We have to focus on justice. We have to trust in Allah. And the idea of spreading, ideas and creating fertile ground, as Muslims, then it's not about fighting with one another, but it's about really creating that fertile ground or taking advantage of that fertile ground, thinking in how do we make this beautiful message most acceptable to people who are searching, whether it's education, whether it's through art, whether it's through music, whether it's through science, showing that, I am at the forefront because I am Muslim and this is what, created. I mean, is that the right way to understand kind of like all of these messages?
Yeah, I mean, it was a unique characteristic of prophethood that the Prophet ﷺ would have a vision and that we would surrender to that vision. Okay? That's something unique to the Prophet ﷺ. You might have a relationship with someone that your heart and soul tells you that their vision comes from God. But that's then surrendering to that vision is on you because you have that privity of experience. But other people who do not have that privity of experience with that person, they're not part of that equation. So surrendering is to surrender to what you know is Allah's will, Allah's law, Allah's morality, Allah's ethics, Allah's virtue. So and the example is demonstrated from Surah al-Fath. But what you've said also, I we Muslims in the West waste a great deal of time bickering with each other. I don't try, for instance, someone who comes and says music is haram. Okay, if this is your sincere and true conviction, as long as you are representing it as your interpretation, and as long as you are not confiscating my right to have a different interpretation, then Allah can settle the differences between us. I don't spend time, maybe there will be the initial attempt to present evidence if this person, asks me to present evidence that they're wrong. But if they don't, I don't even, what the focus ought to be is exactly on finding the fertile grounds to plant. It's one thing, so what I focus on is I don't believe music is haram, is to then focus on how I can make my engagement with music a testament to God's truth, to sprout this goodness. If you notice how much energy is Muslims flexing their muscles against each other, rather than saying, okay, we disagree, let God settle it between us, and let us focus on what good we can offer and we can present. I mean, that's if you truly believe that you have a mission of goodness, you have good to offer the world, you can hardly, then your sense is time is too short, time is passing too fast, and I can hardly find enough time to offer the world all the good that I know I can offer witnessing for God. It is when people do not understand the good that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they find that they feel they can afford the time, they can afford to waste the time in these side marginal battles that are digressions from any goodness that you present. I mean, how do I put it? A truly gifted intellect, right, doesn't waste time bickering over bickering with petty intellects. A truly gifted intellect finds there is hardly enough time to even document all the bright ideas I have. So they're very busy just getting it all down. And they don't have time for distractions. Anyone that wants to argue about something silly, oh well, thank you very much, good luck, and you move on. That's exactly the nature of the relationship between goodness and the divine. When you are when the goodness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permeates your being, you can hardly find enough time to offer the world all the goodness that Allah inspires in you. So anyone that wants to bicker about small things, anyone wants to be depressed, anyone wants to have a fit over this or that, it's like, okay, good luck, thank you, but I don't have time. It is sadly when people don't have a beautiful relationship with Allah, that's when you find what you see in our modern world among Muslims. They don't have their relationship with Allah is not about beauty. It's not about something real, because Allah is beautiful, and there's no way you can truly have any understanding of the divine and not have beauty dripping out of your pores. So those folks who spend their time, bickering about everything they bicker about, including, by the way, what I find like I would say like the big to do these days. Uh, you know, uh, in the Muslim world, this is in the Arab world. I should not in the entire Muslim world, but in the Arab world, big to do about al-Hakim al-Naysaburi. Hakim al-Naysaburi was a scholar of hadith. What is the big to do? Hakim al-Naysaburi died many, many centuries ago, and he wrote an appendix to Bukhari and Muslim. And all these people who want to prove that you shouldn't listen to Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, not because he wasn't reliable, not because he wasn't a good scholar, not because is because they believe he was a Shia. And so all this big, and then sadly, those who are defending Hakim al-Naysaburi are not defending him by saying he was a good scholar, he was reliable, no, they're defending him by saying he wasn't a Shia. It's as if they're conceding the point. If he was a Shia, then we would agree with you. We shouldn't listen to him. And then hours. I can't even represent. People won't believe how many hours, how many scholars, how many lay people have jumped onto this whole thing. Was he a Shi'i? Was he not a Shi'i? If he was a Shi'i, then we should throw away his books. If he wasn't a Shi'i, then he's okay. And you sit there and you wonder how much of the divine has penetrated the heart for this to become the issue. You're not even talking about what were the substantive hadiths in Hakim al-Naysaburi's text. You're not talking about who were the rijal, who were the transmitters that he accepted or he rejected. You are talking about whether someone who died centuries ago was a secret closet Shia or not. To what extent does this evidence a genuine relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You see, I mean, what goodness are you sprouting that any person? I mean, I actually saw like this. There's this Israeli commentator who knows Arabic, and he's always posting videos in Arabic. He works for the Israeli. He's an officer. He's in the Israeli army, and he was mocking Muslims both on both sides. Basically, of course, what type of Islam are you representing? Yeah.
Thank you. And then the last thing I was going to ask is, it seems that like the examples where you were pointing out, you ask yourself, if I were in this situation, some of what people were doing is very human. Like they make, excuses for not following the Prophet, or they, come up with justifications, or they lie to themselves. And it seems that the issue is, which I see in our time too, is this lack of trust and the problem with surrender. And there's sort of a reality schism. It's kind of like, okay, yes, in theory, I believe in God and I trust in God and everything, may Allah, do whatever. But then when it actually comes to the reality of life, you very quickly go, yeah, but we were talking about, my job. We're talking about my relationship. We're talking about my family. We're talking about something, and yes, God, it's like the schism of, do you really trust in God? Well, yes, I do theoretically, but when it really comes down to it, I'm not sure, right?
Right.
So I guess my question is, what would you say to, modern Muslims or Muslims in our time now that are having a difficulty with when it truly comes down to it? It's like, yeah, I believe and I want my life to be about God, but, come on, I just, had this relationship end, or I had, I lost this job that I really cared about, or my friend betrayed me, blah, 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 and trying to think about how do I control the results instead of just letting go and surrendering and trusting, bringing that schism or closing that schism,
I mean,
right?
the worst. I mean, a lot of people don't even get to this point, but if even they get to this point, the worst type of um, is the worst type of relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the relationship that imputes to God a will that is subservient to your own. So you when the idea that I might be doing something wrong, and you assume that God is bound to forgive it, those who forgive themselves before they're forgiven by God, or those who, because they forgive themselves, they deem God as bound to forgive them. Most people don't even get to this point. Most people will think only about their emotions and not even think whether they are doing something that will require forgiveness. They will actually twist the will to say, what I'm doing is not wrong in the first place. So it doesn't need forgiveness because it's not wrong. Well, why isn't it wrong? Not because of any principle, not because of, it's because it's not wrong because I see what I do as justified. So when I look at exigent circumstances, it's like, those who cite exigent circumstances, exceptional circumstances, to say, well, what what I decide or what I've done to be justified in my eyes. So that's the end of the inquiry. Now, if you have a little bit more piety than that, you then go a step further and you say, I deem it justified. So is it justified in God's eyes? Well, the sad reality is most people, most of the time say, well, it's justified in my eyes, so it's also justified in God's eyes. Now, if you have actually a little bit of transparency, honesty, sincerity, you pause and you say, well, it doesn't necessarily follow. I might think it's justified. I might think it's forgivable, but is it necessarily so for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And the standard is due diligence. So you pretend, okay, I will appear before God, and God will say, how much time have you, how much effort, how much energy have you spent on the question of verifying whether, in fact, I, Allah, deemed what you've done to be forgivable? If you were, what would a reasonable person do? A reasonable person would say, well, I would want to tell Allah I did best efforts, at least. Yeah, you are God. I'm not, I'm a human. I might have not guessed your will correctly, but at least I put in best efforts. I put in some hard work that yashfa'li, that would act as my excuse. And so Allah might, even if you got the answer wrong, Allah sees that you've put in the effort, at least the effort at getting the answer right, and that's what you are banking on. It's the effort. But the truth of the matter is, most people don't even get there. Most people, simply because they feel X, Y, and Z, that's the end of it. They don't even get to the point, they don't even get to Allah. And because Allah is not real to them. I mean, Allah is just an abstraction that, like all abstractions, that if we're not accustomed to translating abstractions into lived examples, then it's like the rules of morality. We might not do something wrong because of habit, of custom, of fear, of, but not out of real engagement with morality. But even those who have a bit more piety than that, to get beyond, well, it's just my emotions, my personal circumstance define what is right and wrong, to actually thinking about God, sadly, most don't even put due diligence. They just assume that God's will is at their service. And this is, subhanallah, the real test. Without fail, it's exactly as Surah al-Hajj says. Without fail, these are also the people who worship God at an edge. You will find their closeness or their lack of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wavers by, it's as if, if things are happening, putting them in a, it's as if God is a kid playing with them. Astaghfirullah. If they're feel good, they're in a good mood, they feel good about God, they talk about as if they have real iman. And things go hard for them a little bit, darkness sets in, and they can't even feel the relationship to what just yesterday they might have been talking about their obligations towards God and what God is to them and so on. If you find yourself one of those people who worships God at an edge, then know that this is a clear indication that you also are a person whose treats God's will as subservient to your own. The two go together. You will never find someone who doesn't worship God on an edge, who has a solid relationship with God, who takes God for granted. And vice versa. You won't find a person who doesn't take God for granted who would worship God on an edge. It's a package deal.
Okay, great. Oh, it's time for Maghrib. We have 15 minutes for Maghrib, so should we take a break for Maghrib?
Are there more questions?
Just wanted to take one more round if anyone has any
Okay.
questions. So I've got some now questions from the audience, but not a bunch. So
Okay, let's pray Maghrib and come back then.
and come back. Okay. And if
Okay,
anyone,
we'll pray
if you
for
guys have
Maghrib.
any questions, send them through the chat too. Okay. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We are back. Okay, so we're going to go now to some of the audience questions. Okay, so for Surah al-Fath, verse 17, Sheikh said that he'll come back to this point, but he never did.
نسأل أنا حرج عنه. The okay, so first 17 first it says that it recognizes that people who suffer from a handicap like limpness, they're limp in one leg, or they're blind, or so on. The context of this was twofold. One is that among the tribes that okay, so in previous encounters, among the excuses that would had been cited are people who would say they would cite as a handicap that they لا نعلم قتالا, that they don't know how to fight, and or that's what they would say. And again, the Prophet wouldn't, alayhi salatu wasalam, wouldn't respond. The nature, I mean, Allahu Alam, of course, I mean, how the different duties and functions were specified. But there's a world of difference between those who have a physical impediment that would actually make them that would actually excuse them from fighting, and excuses like we don't know how to fight, which was not recognized, and in fact, I mean, until the modern age, not knowing how to fight was not the nature of fighting was very also different, but was not a recognized excuse. The other thing is that there were several times where people who did suffer from a handicap, like blindness, would come to the Prophet and insist that they want to go out with the army. Now, you notice that verse 17 comes after, right after in Surah al-Fath, it says that you will be called upon to fight a people who are tougher than you've ever fought before. And it sort of preempts this to preempts by defining what is a valid excuse and what is not a valid excuse. Um, and I think, I mean, because of the few situations that we know of that in which people who did suffer from an actual, so we have someone who was blind who did come to the Prophet and wanted to, insisted that he wanted to go out with the army. Someone who had actually one arm, was on one armed, will insist. I think although some of them did in fact manage to get their way and go out, but at least in principle, the Quran comes and says these are not the people that God is talking about in terms of um, uh, copping out of the ordeal. Um, so I mean, it was I think I don't remember what I was saying. I was going to come back to, but that's basically the background or the context of the ayah.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, in Surah Hajj, the Sheikh spoke about the context for verses 52 through 54 as being about hesitations and doubts that people have regarding the moral mission of the revelation. In verse 52, Allah says He abrogates what Shaitan suggests and fixes His ayat. What is Allah referring to here? What are the ayat, and why is the term abrogation used regarding people's doubts and hesitations?
Yeah, I mean it's. I mean, because we are accustomed to reading the word ayah as meaning a verse of the Quran. But remember that ayatullah is used in the Quran as any form of all the different forms that Allah communicates with human beings. So, and notice how it is worded. وما أرسلنا من قبلك من رسول ولا نبي إلا إذا تمنى ألقى الشيطان في أمنيته. So إلا إذا تمنى ألقى الشيطان في أمنيته. It's not that the shaitan, it doesn't say that the shaitan does anything to the actual revelation. It doesn't specify that. It says, but the shaitan affects or influences literally the thinking or the aspirations of the prophet. So it's Allah saying, time and again, shaitan influences or attempts to influence the plans, the goals, the aspirations, even if you will, if you say the fi umniyati could even be the mood, the feelings, all of that could be covered by إذا تمنى ألقى الشيطان في أمنيته. Then after that, فينسخ الله ما يلقي الشيطان. So Allah ينسخ here again. Later on, nasakh gains the meaning abrogation in a very technical sense. But nasakh, before it gained that highly technical meaning, just simply meant to replace something, to erase something and replace it with something else. So when that happened, when that the feelings, the aspirations, the goals, the thinking is influenced by shaitan, then Allah replaces whatever influence shaitan has left. ثم يحكم الله آياته. Then Allah perfects Allah's ayat. The context, if you forget the technical meaning of ayah as a verse in the Quran, and you place and you recall that ayat is used throughout the Quran as Allah's signs, Allah's communications. So Allah perfects yuhkim, that it's as if Allah makes sure that whatever not just what the prophet utters, but even what this prophet feels, what this prophet plans, what this prophet does here, then ثم يحكم آياته would have the much broader meaning than just verses of the Quran. So Allah makes sure that whatever this prophet not just says in terms of revelation, and not just the Prophet Muhammad, but all prophets, that what ultimately would they end up representing to people, what they end up, the example they set for people, even the emotions that people pick up from them are so Allah's direct relationship with the prophets, because the prophets are Allah. The context of the discourse here is that prophets are examples unto humanity, and so whatever influence shaitan might have on these prophets in terms of even their desires, Allah is bound to correct it. It is, the words yansakh and the words ayat later on, much later on, gain the technical meaning of abrogation as a nasikh wal mansukh, or the technical meaning as ayat al-Quran, the verses of the Quran, and so on.
Thank you. Okay, for Surah al-Fath, in verses 3 and 7, to God belong the forces, troops of the heaven and earth. If things are always going to work out the way Allah wants them to, does this contradict being optimistic? Are we supposed to be realistic only, or neutral? For example, just get the work done without anticipating anything, without ever being pessimistic or optimistic? What about people who make positive affirmations and are confident that things will go their way? What about the so-called law of attraction? I see that the people who abandoned the Prophet were being realistic. Their only flaw seems to be that they did not truly believe in the vision of the Prophet.
What verses did she say? Or did he say? Or
3 and 7
this is
in Fath.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. That's what I thought. I didn't meant to say. Yeah, I'm not sure why you're specifying 3 and 7. Because 3 simply the promise of victory to the Prophet, unless they got the wrong verses.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
And 7, the God in fact, the heavens and earth, if God wants, become soldiers of God. Um, but I think that there's a broader question about. Can I? Good. Which one? Okay. Um, because to God belongs the forces, troops of the heavens. No, to God belongs the troops of the heavens and earth. Um, وَلِلَّهِ جُنُودُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. It doesn't mean that the heavens and earth are always the troops of God, or um, they do carry out God's will, but the, in this particular area, that if God wishes to turn the heavens and earth into soldiers of God, this is like telling us, don't forget that you are not living on a neutral platform. This platform could turn into an army of God, carrying out God's will, whatever that will is, whenever God wants. Um, so it has a, a specific meaning in this context. But the larger question, um, being being optimistic, how to optimism is, it's a certain type of optimism. Optimism in many ways is a sign of piety. Not, it doesn't, optimism doesn't mean that you believe that whatever your will is, whatever your whim is going to actually come true. Optimism is that you, or the type of optimism that is grounded in piety, is that you ask Allah to present you your will if it is what is best. And ultimately, you are happy with whatever Allah presents. So, truly pious people, you will always find that they are very content. Not that they don't aspire, not that they don't hope, not that they don't plan. They do. And in fact, they will always tell you, I trust that, I have complete trust that if this is the best for me, Allah will in fact make it happen. But if it doesn't, and if Allah's will always makes me happy. So you can aspire, you can plan, you can hope, you can have a bright outlook, and in fact, that is a sign that you are at peace with your existence, that you are not at war with your existence. As long as, if you don't get your way, it doesn't become you don't act like a tyrant with your own existence. Meaning that if I don't get my way, then I am angry and upset and resentful. Yeah, so I mean, I see that people. Oh, about it, it is not a small thing that for the Prophet ﷺ to have a vision um, and for you to ignore it. This is, again, this comes from part of, it's one thing if you don't believe in the person as a prophet. So that is their sin is the hypocrisy of saying we believe in that what the you are in fact getting your orders from God, and for the Prophet ﷺ to tell them this is God's will, and for them to say, well, although we said we believe you represent God's will, but we're going to ignore it anyway. That is the problem. So, if I believe that my mother is connected to God, and she comes to me and she says, I want you to do X, and I ask her, is this your opinion, or do you know this to be God's will? And she says, no, it's my opinion. Then I take it or leave it. If she says, no, I know this to be God's will, the only question then becomes, do I really believe that my mother represents God's will or not? If I do, then I should not have an option. If I don't believe that she represents God's will, that's a different matter. Then I can tell my mother, with all due respect, but, I don't believe that you can represent God's will. I don't believe that you know what God's will is. That's a separate matter. If they would have gone to the Prophet ﷺ and said, well, your vision is just, you've ate something that night and you had a stomachache. It's not from God. Then they would have confessed their lack of belief, and that they would be like the hypocrites, who incidentally are not even mentioned in Surat al-Fath, which is interesting enough that the typical hypocritical bunch who never really didn't sincerely say or didn't represent. They were always the dissenting faction and always opposing the Prophet and so on. They're like, no one even bothered inviting them to Hajj. But it is the fact that they claim they believe and they're told that this is God's will, and they said, well, we have another opinion. If it is one of the most liberating things, I wish we raised our generations of Muslims on this idea. One of the most liberating things is to be told, be honest with God and be consistent with God. Because then you can identify points of weakness of faith in yourself. But to say, I believe and I trust, but then give yourself the freedom not to follow through on what you say you believe in, you become exactly like those the Quran describes, those who say but do not do. Those who learn that there's a huge disparity between what they claim their convictions are and what their actions evidence in terms of their conviction. Your actions must always be an affirmation of your true convictions. The sooner you learn to interrogate your actions because they are the true evidence of what you really believe, the sooner you start evolving as a moral human being. Because it becomes quite simple. If I am acting immorally, then I am immoral. Most human beings, this is actually something that, you know, very surprised me when in the legal field, is that to discover that most criminals never actually come to terms with the fact that they committed crimes. They commit crimes and they never. The reason they don't plead guilty is because they actually never confess. Most never confess that they're actually guilty of whatever they've committed. And most criminals actually continue believing that they're good people. I'm talking about murderers and rapists and, thieves and people who commit horrible assaults. They actually, I've had conversations with people who it was clear they're guilty of rape, but they talk to you as if they're essentially a good human being. I've read a book of a serial killer who talks about being fundamentally a nice person who just had a minor problem. He just killed 9 women, that's all. And Jesus was waiting to welcome him with open arms because, he knows, in the book he says, in the interview he says, I know where I'm going to go when I die because, I've always loved Jesus. Yes, I've killed 9 women, but I've always loved Jesus. And I know that, Jesus is waiting to... Human beings, the immorality is built on dishonesty. And that's what the Quran roots out. Don't get accustomed to being a deceitful human being, most of all, deceitful towards yourself and your God.
Okay. We actually are out of questions. And we're close to
That's
the
a good
end.
thing.
Yeah. So we finished before 10 o'clock. So just one last call if anybody has any last questions. I feel like, especially you've spoken a lot about Hajj and the condition of Hajj right now. I don't know if you have any last thoughts, because obviously we live in a time when things are... Hajj is obvious. If Prophet Muhammad were to come back to life, peace be upon him, and, as you've said many times, he would be mortified by the state of Hajj. And, it leaves us in a really difficult position. I know there are a lot of people who feel that, on the one hand, they completely agree with the idea that, the control of Hajj is in unclean hands, and yet at the same time they feel unable to say, well, yes, but this is one of the pillars. How can I make that choice to not go, even though I believe that? I wonder if maybe we could finish on just some thoughts on that, because we have had people ask that question before.
I mean, no one is saying that Hajj is not a farida. Hajj remains a pillar, and in fact, all it means is that we have an obligation. I mean, can you imagine if Muslims would have understood from the beginning, from the 1930s, when they knew that the Wahhabis had committed massacres and had destroyed grave sites of the companions, and has destroyed mosques of the companions. They knew that. And they knew that the Wahhabis had massacred Shia, have massacred Sufis, have massacred even they used to massacre Shafi'i shuyukh and Hanafi shuyukh and Maliki shuyukh. And can you imagine from the 1930s if Muslims would have said, okay, we can't do Hajj? By now, the fate of Mecca would have been very different. Because Muslims accepted the moral compromise of, okay, yeah, we know they're horrible, we know they're murderers, we know they're fanatics, we know they're this, we know they're that, but we're going to go do Hajj anyway, and we're going to put all this money in their hands. It kept getting worse and worse, and more Islamic heritage sites got destroyed, to the point that the house of Sittina Khadija's home is now toilets. It kept getting worse year after year after year after year, and Shaitan doesn't go from 0 to 100 overnight. So maybe if God sees that we are resolved to liberate our holy sites, both Jerusalem and Mecca and Medina, maybe God will actually help us. So that's one. Two, do you know what it means to come to terms? I mean, it's also part of to come to terms with the fact that you will leave this earth, and you say to yourself, I'm probably not going to see Mecca and Medina again. It kills you, especially if you visited them already, because once you, of course, alhamdulillah, that I haven't seen Mecca after it became Las Vegas. That's one of the things I'm very grateful for. After we were, in all the books of Sharia, we were learning from the time we were, children. No building is allowed in Mecca that is higher than the Kaaba. And suddenly the same shuyukh that used to write these fatwa, in an instant, dropped it, just because, a corrupt ruler told them to drop it. Anyway, to have a sincere intent, and Allah knows your intent. If Allah knows that if you had the ability to go to Hajj, you wouldn't have gone, then God will hold you accountable for that. But if Allah knows that in your heart you sincerely, if you had the ability, because Mecca was in clean hands, you would have gone. Of course, Allah knows what is in your heart. But don't forget that what critical to this is that the money that you were going to spend on Hajj, that was going to go to this Hindu nationalistic company that is planning on genocide in India, and that even is in bed and now funding Islamophobes all over the West, that this money, that you put it apart and you spend it on truly Islamic causes. This is critical, because if Allah knows that you had the means and you just simply forgot that fifth pillar of Islam, that's a very heavy responsibility and a heavy accountability. And if a miracle happens and the Saudis actually recognize that what they're doing is haram, and sit with Muslims and actually come to negotiate terms to clean up their act, maybe this would be a different situation. But right now, it is just abysmal. I mean, the money that is given to these people goes to slaughtering people to continue on the genocide in Yemen that we are all aware of, that continue on to the sworn war by the Saudis and the Emiratis against all forms of liberty and democracy and human rights all over the Muslim world. Goes Saudi Arabia just this year executed more people than it ever executed in any previous year since its founding. And many of those executed were minors. And no consequences. No one says anything. I mean, this is the supposed custodians of the two holy sites imprisoned shuyukh of the caliber of Salman al-Oda and Hassan Farhan al-Malki. What's left? I mean, they took all the clergy who were truly God-fearing, had any advanced level of knowledge, and threw them in prison. Killing them is slow, agonizing death. And the only shuyukh who are not in prison are the ones who are kissing up to MBS and to the Saudi government. And no consequences. No one says, okay, we're not going to spend a single dollar supporting you until at a minimum you release all these Muslim scholars. It's, at what point do you make a stand? I think we Muslims should have made a stand from the 1930s, when Britain dictated that it's the Wahhabis who are going to be the controllers of Mecca. I mean, so Britain dictated that Palestine belongs to Israel, to the Zionists, and that Mecca belongs to the Wahhabis, and that even in India, British colonialism is the one that brought to the fore Hindi, in order to fight the Islamic influence in India. We Muslims kept kept ignoring all the signs that there is a systematic war against Islam that is intended to obliterate Islam from its very core, from Jerusalem to Mecca to Medina to a once very influential part of the Muslim world, India, and we kept ignoring it, and that's where we are now today. At what point do we start saying, okay, enough is enough. Now we've got to be serious. We have to stop dealing with the world like we're children who are historically challenged, morally challenged, philosophically challenged, so anthropologically challenged. I mean, challenged at every level that matters. And what do we care about out of all of this? Hijab and Shia and Sunnah. And I mean,
Well, that's a good place to end it. Not a happy note, but a real note.
Yeah,
And inshallah, it begins with understanding the truth and what's happening and what needs to change. So alhamdulillah, thank you so much, Sheikh, as always, for an amazing Q&A session. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. We look forward to being together again in a week's time, where inshallah we will have a new surah. And, we only have 3 surahs left that have not been touched, either through Project Illumine or line by line, and a whole bunch of shorter ones that haven't been touched by Project Illumine. So we will see, inshallah, what Saturday holds. Have a wonderful week, everybody. Wonderful to see you, and assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.